Hello, everyone. This is Eric Harris with the Game Plan at Disability Rights California. We're super excited to have two amazing guests for this episode on the ADA, the 36th anniversary of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. We had Tom Olin, who is an amazing leader and advocate, and then we also had Anita Cameron, who's a fantastic leader. Both of these individuals are elders in the disability movement and disability community, have been doing great work for a really long time. Tom is a photojournalist who we got to talk to a little bit about the importance of photojournalism. And then Anita is an activist who has been in the movement for decades and decades, and talks a lot about her experience as a Black disabled woman, especially in decades past in the 70s and 80s, and what that experience was like. So hope you all enjoy this wonderful episode. So welcome everyone to another episode of the Game Plan podcast with Disability Rights California. My name is Eric Harris, and we have an amazing special guest for this episode, Tom Olin, who will tell us a lot about his background and his journey in the disability space. We're so lucky to have you, Tom. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. And I really love being a part of Disability Rights California.
Fantastic. Tom, can you tell us a little bit about your connection to the disability community, to the disability movement? You've been in the space for a long time.
Yeah, well, I have dyslexia, so I was always put into a special room or special seats for slow learners, or the dummy class, or whatever it was called. But and that was in elementary school where that started. By the time I got into junior high and high school, I could figure out enough that I almost forgot I had dyslexia. I just did audio stuff, and I made it work for me. And I actually was accepted into a college, and then found out within the first semester that they didn't have any programs for me, and I had to write and do things that I hadn't done, and so I had to drop out. And
Yeah.
but in dropping out, what was really interesting was that I ended up um, um, working in the rehab hospital in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and
Yeah.
and that was the first time I got to be with phys and other disabilities. I was in a floor award that was in my own age, so that was around 18 years old, 18, 19 years old, and it was definitely eye-opening. And I really got to some of the people that were there as patients as such, are still friends with me.
Mm.
Well, I should say a lot of them have died right now, but one of the patients was Diane Coleman, and I don't know if you know Diane Coleman.
Mm.
She
Mm.
was she ended up doing Not Dead Yet, was some of the early attorneys in the ADAPT world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and and I actually um, got to meet her a couple of times after the rehab space. And I mean, that was a high drama. People came in with traumatic injuries from traumatic injuries, and it was like, I either want to die or I'm going to get through this. And that, so it was pretty emotional diagram of how people looked at people with disabilities, how people with
Mm.
disabilities, you know, what they thought they were going to have out there.
Mhm.
High drama. and I really enjoyed it. I
Yeah.
don't- that's just me. Um, so I ended up kind of going outside, going off the grid for about 10 years after that, in the mountains of the Ozarks. And then I ended up coming out and ended up on an island in Brazil. And no one spoke English. And so I finally was talking to myself to hear English, it was quite interesting. And what was interesting, it was like a meditation. I got to ask, I figured, oh, I can ask myself questions and then answer myself.
That's
We
right.
don't have time nowadays to do that at all. Uh,
Mhm.
and and so I asked myself those questions, what are you on the earth for? What's your plan to do next?
Mhm.
What has the path up until now brought you, and where does it look like it's going? And I ended up saying, I really wanted to get back into disability somehow, and da da
I
da.
love that. I
And
love it.
and so it was kind of funny. I got to say, okay, where on the earth do you want to go to do that or pursue that path? And I said, Berkeley.
One question that I have, photojournalism, is a space that you got into, and we haven't, so far we've done this podcast for about a year, and we haven't interviewed anybody who's a photojournalist. Can you just talk a little bit about the importance of photojournalism as a tool for the disability rights movement?
Yes, and it's changed. That tool has changed. And we're kind of grappling with it right now again. In the beginning, when I was doing this, um, I was taking pictures, and they ended up in a lot of the organizations, bulletins. They didn't have web pages back there, so it was always like a newsletter, you know.
Right.
And I would always, when it came to, if they wanted to pay me, great, but I always gave myself away. And I'm really glad. I really, when they say give and you might get tenfold back, and it really was like that, and still is like that. People still remember me, giving their organizations photos. But the importance was, and the photos is so different from writing. You know,
Mm.
people until people sometimes see a photo, they don't believe the writing.
Yeah.
I remember in Brazil, one of we had magazines back there, back then, back in the 70s and the 80s, and to the 90s. It was late 70s, the 80s, and then the 90s, and they kind of went away when big social media came about, and we really don't have those magazines anymore. And these are magazines that edited what was going on. And
Mm.
there's no magazine. There's some social media that
Right.
that kind of does that, but not like, and it doesn't have the photos like that. And when you're like talking with community, if we're talking community, there's many ways of looking at where, what's the emphasis, what's your venue, what does, you know, where does the photos go to, and why? And in the beginning, when the movement was happening, and there was the IL movement, and then you
Mm.
had the disability rights movement, and they intersected at times, and a lot of the
Mm.
players are the same players.
Yeah.
Um, but especially when it came to the disability rights, people saw pictures that they could not believe that
Mm.
disabled people could do.
Right. Right.
I mean, they were really night and day. I can remember back then in elementary school, and I don't know, we had the weekly readers, and it always showed, what was happening around the United States. And
Yeah.
My fold was probably the first time that kids got to see the power of people with disabilities instead
Wow.
of the Jerry Lewis thing that was going
Right.
on, Um,
Right.
so that was very important. And to get it into places where elementary schools and things like that. And I also in LA, I also um, worked for the LI Unified as a aide in special ed.
Mm.
And I got to bring my photo books and show the kids, and I remember one kid, and he was in this one, and I was a sub at different places, so I got to go all over the place.
Nice.
It's
Nice.
one elementary school that the kid, um, I showed him the book, and it, it was like, um, it was a line of people with disabilities, about 100 or more. And
Yeah.
he just looked at me. He said, I didn't know there were that many people just in chairs in the world.
Man.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
like, it was just, and that was the early days of disability photography. People got to see things different
Yeah.
in a way.
Well, and you've been around, you've seen it all. You've been able to take photos of a bunch of different major events and major things. Is there one or maybe a couple of like moments where you're doing your work and taking photos and just recognizing, wow, this is really some powerful stuff,
Yeah.
even, all the things that you've seen.
Um, that's kind of a funny question, because we're trying to grow a movement.
Mm,
And so there are, people will say, oh, it's a capital crawl photo. Um, um, my favorite ones were the people that were on the front lines that
mm,
came out of the institutions and said, hey, I want to be on the front line. I'll save up my SSI money. I'll go out and fundraise. I'll, to get to those places during the big adapt movement that came up to the ADA and got help get the ADA passed. To me, that was more. Here, people came out of fucking institutions, and said, "I want to go because I have people back in the institutions that need to get out." To
mm,
me, photographing their empowerment
mm,
was what I loved,
mm,
But I could also, take photos. That the other part of that was also how do you, how does the movement rise? How does the movement connect? And when people got to see connection of different places, they adapt went to different cities all over the United States plus in Canada,
mm.
um, and with hundreds and hundreds of people. And you don't see that anymore. Um,
Yeah.
and you don't see, people forget that even before the ADA happened, over 1,000 people with disabilities were put in jail. You know,
Mm,
um,
yeah.
that's something that is incredible and doesn't happen. I mean, really doesn't happen as much anymore. I mean, back
Right.
then, sometimes you went in jail for 5 days, and you can imagine what some of the people, especially the quads, that was almost life threatening.
Right. Absolutely.
We had magazines. We had the Disability Rag. We had the Mouth magazine. We had a couple. We had Cindy Jones's magazine, which I can't remember what the name was right now, but we had what was happening, especially with the Mouth and the Disability Rag. I worked with the
Yeah.
Mouth, so I can say this is that what we did is that the Rag would produce their magazine 1 month, we would do the next month, so that
Mm,
things were, people could read just pretty much what was happening now to now. I mean, now it's like every day, but you can't really see what's happening in the disability movement every day. You would have to go to 15 different organizations' websites to find it. You know,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
really impossible. Back then, you could be sitting on your john or whatever, reading one of the magazines, and probably 1,000 other people around the United States was doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And, and people thought people were close to the movement that way.
Yeah.
People felt like they were in the movement at
I
that.
love it.
It was totally, we don't have that kind of, and was a movement that you trusted, that,
Mhm.
and and so it was a whole different time and world that photojournalism could come into play and be.
Yeah.
It was. I remember our magazine, The Mouth. The White House. Um, they got like seven copies or more. Uh,
Wow.
it was, people that were in the know needed to have those magazines to know what was happening, because they weren't saying, oh, this is a great, government administration, or even this is a great sale. No, we said if there was a bad sale, people would hear about it.
Yeah.
Was
Yeah.
it was a bad players in the administration, we would say something. We didn't have, actually, we didn't have, and that's why we probably don't have it anymore, but we didn't have any kind of advertising on our
Right.
own. It was totally a little different. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's fantastic and very fascinating. That you mentioned the ADA bus tours. We're gonna kind of shift forward a bit towards ADA bus tours, kind of around the times of trying to get the ADA across the finish line, passing the ADA. What were the ADA bus tours like?
Well, the ADA bus tour came after the ADA was passed, but on the first ADA bus tour, which it's still the organization that helped start that was ADA Watch, with Jim
Mm.
Ward still was doing that. And well, we're at a we're at a friend's house, and a whole collection of us um, have disability people that wanted to do things. But Jim and his wife and kids and I, we got two buses, and what we did was we went around to every state, every
Mm.
state. But we had to fly in. We didn't. We had to leave the buses to fly into Hawaii and Alaska. But other than that, we hit every state and do it. And it's the same. What happened with our our um, our father of ADA. Give me his name. Justin Dart.
Justin
Yeah.
Dart, yes, of course.
Oh my God. Well, anyhow, he did these ADA diaries, and he went around and collected names and collected signatures, and so we did that too, because at that time the ADA was real in trouble.
Mm.
2003, four, and so we went around, got names and everything like that, um, and what was really interesting is that, well, it was really great. We went to capitals, we went to expo fairs, we
Mm.
went all over the place, and it was like we there aren't too many things like that in the disability world.
Mm.
Tying people together in different places, and um, it's it was an iconic, very iconic. So there were people that would drive their family to wherever we were just to see the bus. And the bus was kind of neat. The bus was covered in the photos, some of my photos.
Oh, wow.
And so at different places on the bus, you could. It was like a 35 footer. So it was a
Mm.
pretty big bus, and you could there might be a picture of protest stuff, and people would, okay, I want my photo here, or and things like that all around it. It was just something else,
Fantastic.
and you drive, and people would everyone loved it, uh,
Wow.
and,
Yeah.
and then in 2015 I did the same thing. I got the bus back, and and did the tour again, or did different tours with that. Um, and there, and at that time, well, then I did other things, building registration with the bus,
Right. Right.
um, um, a lot of disaster stuff. I
Hmm.
would talk about history, and I had a lot of photos that I got to take out to, into different room and to different um, venues like auditoriums and things like that that could be put around, independent living centers or uh,
Yeah.
special ed schools. That was a really good one. I remember going to 360, which is a very large independent living center in Phoenix, Arizona.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, and they brought in. I always, whatever the thing was, I said, make sure that you have group homes, you have everyone that's connected with disability that can come. The thing about the trip too, I would park wherever people were, the organization were, and they'd
That's
bring their
right.
staff and whatever. And those photos are still hanging on walls,
Mm.
Um, and it's kind of tight. It was like um, a town crier. You go from one place to another place, and it was always interesting that um, you could go 100 miles and people didn't know what they were doing from one geographical area to another, and what great things were happening around.
Mm.
So I got to, talk about great things that are happening all over.
Wow. Wow. Well, one question that I have for you, you were able to kind of witness pre-ADA, post-ADA, and then all of the things that happened afterwards. What are some of the things that you would say are like the things that really stand out, like when you notice pre-ADA versus post-ADA?
Now, because I was doing the bus tour,
Mm.
you know, at the it was so funny because I'd go to the towns that were towns and small villages and things like that. Go through them, and before the ADA, there was no disability anything, and then one of the places that driving and always had parking lots that were big enough for the bus, I'd be at
Right.
Walmart's, and you go into Walmart's and there are people with disabilities. The aisles were wide. It was kind of like, oh my God, and people. That's where a lot of people in the county would meet. Or I think the greatest thing was you go through a small town and sometimes, or yeah, or it'd be the county seat, and they'd have the big courthouse in the middle, and then it'd be a block of just grass around it and
Mm.
benches, and and before you just see some of the old guys, whittling, the whatever, and the next time after the ADA, there were accessible sidewalks and stuff like that, and there were people in wheelchairs that were by the benches, or
Mm.
doing the same things as the other people used to do, and I got to in the second part, one of the things. Um, there were a lot of I would stop at a city, for a city, and there'd be the mayor and the da da da, and they would always talk about what they've been doing, what's happening, and you'd ask, well, how's your building, inspectors and stuff like that, or because that would really show me where they're at, and people, things were getting done and they were proud of them.
Mm,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
Nowadays, I don't know if they'd be proud, but back then it was, things were working really well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what would you like to see? I mean, as you know, there are advocates all over the country who might be tuning in and want to, hear different thoughts and ideas. What would you say you'd like to see going forward when it comes to disability rights, the ADA, the disability rights movement? Like, are there any things that come to mind that you would just love to see in the next 20 years or 30 years?
Oh, that could be a whole another show. The thing is that, I got to see the history of stuff. And the history is always an amazing thing. And I've worked with the YLF youth leadership forums in different states, and the youth enjoy the history. And it's the old saying is you can't go forward unless you know where you've been.
Yeah,
I'm not saying that what is reported should be exactly what you'd be doing, but knowing that other people have done different things that should open you up to whatever maybe you can do. Um, so I think that's really, really important, and definitely making sure that the youth are, I, I still, I call myself an elder, um,
hmm,
and and there's just too many people that should be letting the youth rise up a little bit more, put them into places where there is a ladder effect and they can rise up into different positions. I
that's
think
right.
really important. Um, and I think we just have to get back to who we, like I was talking about the two differences of the movements. One was making, the community accessible, and that's important. Um, and the other one is we still don't work on people that are institutionalized.
Hmm,
Um, we don't work in the prisons hardly, and
hmm,
yet there are more people with disabilities than not in a prison or
that's
jail.
right.
We got so many people still on in guardianship, and the reason and the thing is that the only reasons they're in guardianships because we don't have the services that mitigates that,
That's right.
or they don't have. We have SILs that can mitigate that, but judges don't know those
Right.
things. We still have DD institutions. We still have um, you know we have a lot of people that we have to realize that they are a part of us, and that's
Yeah.
at the very beginning that we knew that. Now it's just like, oh, let's get the funding to this. We got to, money has come in, corporate has come in, and corporate is taking over our disability services. So that's a whole nother world too,
Yeah. Yeah.
and yeah, there's a lot,
Yeah.
a lot to do still.
No, you're exactly right, Tom, and I'm really glad that you brought up the institutionalization and whether it's jails, prisons, immigration detention facilities, whether it's, mental health state hospitals, whether it's, DD institutions. Those are the spaces that, our advocacy is needed most. And I'm glad that you brought that up because it's happening all over the country, including in California, unfortunately.
Yeah, you got the good care plan, care courts right now. The only time I got arrested was I'm really good at not getting arrested at actions because the thing is that if you get arrested, then you can't take photos anymore. And then but at one point I was up in New York Syracuse. I think it was in Syracuse, and it was a demonstration at a mental health facility in a hospital, and I just said, "Okay, it's time for me to get arrested." I said, "Here's my camera, take it away," you know.
Uh,
And you know, after a while, after seeing everyone getting arrested, all these, for years and years and years, you feel kind of funny not being arrested, you know.
I want to be included.
Yeah. Same way with Evan Kemp um, and Justin Dart Jr. At the very end of their lives, they were trying to they'd go to an adapt action and say, "Hey, okay, put us where we can get arrested."
Mm.
They never got arrested, but they wanted to. That was one of the things, that they wanted to do. They never
That
got.
is fantastic. Thank you so much, Tom, for joining us and giving us so much history and knowledge and ways to move forward. So we really appreciate all that you do. Welcome everybody to the Game Plan with Disability Rights California. My name is Eric Harris, and I am with Anita Cameron, who is a just a fantastic leader in our movement, historic leader in our movement. We're so lucky to have her. Welcome, Anita.
Thank you. It's great to
Well,
be here.
if you could, because I know some of the folks who might be tuning in don't know what adapt is. They might, of course, be able to Google it and look it up. But can you just let folks know what adapt is,
So,
and why it's so important?
so ADAPT is a national grassroots disability rights group that it fights for disability rights. It was officially formed in 1983. I joined in 1986. But the folks who made up the to talk about adapt, you have to go back to 1978
Hmm.
and probably before. But in 1978, on July 5th and 6th, there were 19 people gathered at the southwest corner of Colfax and Broadway in Denver, Colorado. And they were trying to get on the bus. Now, these folks were all young folks with disabilities. Most of them, they had come out of a nursing home
Hmm.
about 4 years prior. Most of them had come out of the single nursing home and had moved into the community and saw that disabled people still couldn't get around, couldn't get into buildings, couldn't get on buses or anything. And so those folks began meeting with the bus companies to say, like, put a lift on these buses, put some way that people in wheelchairs can get on the bus. And our regional transportation district kept saying no. And so finally, on July 5th and 6th, 19 folks, they would be known as the Gang of 19, got out of their wheelchairs and lay in the street for 2 days, um, fight for lifts on buses. That, that was a disability shot heard around the world. And that was also the beginnings of the foundings of ADAPT. Until I joined ADAPT at the age of 21, and I joined in Chicago. And at that time, ADAPT stood for American Disabled for Accessible Public Transportation.
Hmm.
And we would go around, we did, yes, block buses, chained ourselves to buses, handcuffed
Hmm.
ourselves to buses. Um, we blocked buildings. We traveled the American Public Transit Association, the Urban Mass Transit Association and all. We followed these folks around the country and protested at their conventions.
Wow.
And and obviously lots of us got arrested and all. But we were, obviously we were looking at other forms of
Right.
access. Like when the Americans with Disabilities Act was introduced, and Justin Dart was going around the country doing his town halls. I participated in some of those. Major Owens was going around doing his
Mm-hmm.
stuff. Do you know a lot of people don't even know who Major Owens was?
Oh, I know.
Don't know who Major Owens was, and his involvement and what he did and what he used, his power to do in the ADA. How that was his most proudest achievement, and how even then he was still erased,
I know.
from
Yeah.
the story. So, we were doing all of that, and over the years we were seeing the ADA get solid. Now, DAP, we were like, I mean, a lot of times people considered us like riffraff. They didn't even want to deal with us. We were considered militants and radicals.
Right.
We were compared to the Black Panthers and ACT UP, which to me, those are badges of honor. So, hey,
Hey,
because I was involved with ACT UP, and we had ADAPT members who were Black Panthers.
that's
In
right.
fact, ADAPT was the only group that I had been involved with in all my social justice experience where I wasn't the only Black, or I wasn't the only disabled, or both. I
Mm,
wasn't the token. About half of us were Black.
mm.
A bunch of us Latine, a number of us queer. Adapt accepted it all. Adapt accepted all of us. We had Native
Yeah.
Americans, Asians, Latino, you name it. We had it in the Adapt. Trans folks and the most unlikely people in the
Right.
Adapt, including myself, rose to leadership.
Mm,
And so, we were looking, when we were seeing, we felt like the ADA was in danger. I
mm.
remember Wade Blank telling me, man, Nita, we got to do something, because if we don't, he said, we could be here 3 years from now still trying to figure stuff out. And so, uh, that was back in the days when ADAPT was very, very open and talk openly about things. We would learn quickly not to do that because of
Mm-hmm.
police infiltration and all.
Mm-hmm.
But we decided that we were we decided we had to do something. And that's how the Capital Crawl came in. Adapt,
Well, it's interesting.
organize the Capital Crawl.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, Miss Cameron, because I was going to ask you, you are an educated person. You know that to a certain extent, having so-called traditional educated folks involved is helpful. Folks who can do the policy work, folks who can do the talking to elected officials and getting policy passed. But you also recognize that protest and being physically present and showing your frustration is also a big part of it, whether it's, you know, like ADAPT or the Black Panthers or other groups. So can you just talk a little bit about why both of those roles are important, that we need folks who are in politics and policy changing the laws, but we also need folks who are out there on the streets making noise about, what's going on.
Well, actually, what a lot of people don't realize about Adapt is by the time you see an Adapt action, an Adapt protest,
Mhm.
meetings have been going on,
Mm,
education has been going on. Um, we have been talking to the politicians for the legislative. Bob Kafka, um,
Mm.
he called what ADAPT does the pitch. He called it using the pitchfork method. I called it the multi-pronged effort,
Mm.
so that protesting and direct action, that is the last thing.
Yeah, yeah,
You want to start out with meeting the targets. You want to start out with educating. You know, you want to, there's a legislative aspect. If you have to, and ADAPT has written legislation
hmm
and whatnot, and I've actually helped in that. Um, Sometimes it takes some legislative stuff. When we do this in ADAPT, we were prepared for the long run. We knew that it was going to take years, even decades, and it's been decades, and things, still, aren't. And so, also like lawsuits, sometimes you got to sue them, you
mm.
know. So there's a multi-pronged, um, um, uh, for lack of better words, attack or approach in advocacy, that that by the time you see us, blocking doors and chained to buses, we've already done all of the homework, the research, the meetings. We've been told so many times, and we're just not going to take no
Yeah,
anymore.
yeah,
And then we decide, okay, it's time to hit the streets. And just like the folks with the civil rights movement, I mean, we are so committed to, you know, uh, to fighting, for disability rights that we, are willing to get arrested. I've been arrested 140 times in the
yeah.
DAP, in 39 years of active involvement. I've been doing this stuff for 44 years now, community organizing,
hmm
and whatnot. And it's still, I mean, here it is, it's going to be 36 years post ADA. And we, disabled people, we are still, um, we're still suffering injustice. But,
hmm
I tell people all the time, as much as I fought for the ADA and got arrested, and did the Capitol crawl and got arrested in the rotunda, the next day and went to jail and all of that, that
hmm
the ADA is the floor. It is not the ceiling.
That's right.
I tell people the biggest thing that the ADA did not do for disabled people was guarantee us the civil right to live in our communities with services and supports that we need. Disabled people, we still don't have the civil right
Mm.
to be in our communities.
Mm.
Um, Due to what's known as the institutional bias, we can get put in nursing homes, and whatnot, put in different places, and all. Uh, Society is trained to see us, as incompetent, useless. We don't even know. When I was 19, I was living in Michigan, and I was living on my own. And yeah, once again, my seizures got out of control pretty bad. Um, and so I was taken to hospital. The town that I lived in was so tiny that we didn't have a hospital. And so the
Mm.
ambulance took me to Cadillac, which was 30 miles from where I live. And I was in the hospital for a week in Cadillac, Michigan, and getting the seizures controlled. And it seemed like things were, okay. That seemed like I was stabilized and whatnot. And I began to ask to go home. Um, and they wouldn't, no one would tell me anything if I was going home. And one day, the sheriff came and got me from the hospital. That's how I was discharged. And the sheriff took me. And I thought that I was going home.
Mm.
Um, the sheriff took me to Traverse City, Michigan, 400 miles away
Wow.
to the northeast. And I was taken to a psychiatric hospital.
Yeah.
And I was taken before a judge who was attached to that hospital. I would later find that that hospital was 100 years old. Um,
Wow.
and they told me that they were going to put me in this hospital because they said that I was a danger to myself because I wanted to go home. They
Mm.
said that there was no way that someone with my combination of disabilities could live independently and that me wanting to go home was harming myself. Now,
Wow.
I had been living independently,
Right. Right.
but, and so they said that up to 60 days is what they told
Mm.
me.
Mm.
Up to 60 days turned into 8.5 months. I
Wow.
was railroaded into a psychiatric institution simply because, as a disabled person, I wanted to. Now, obviously, that turned around and did something to me. Trust and believe me.
Absolutely.
The psychiatric hospital that I was in, like I said, was 100 years old. And if you've ever seen or read the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that
Mm.
was that hospital.
Wow.
Um, there were rapes that happened,
Hmm.
beatings and whatnot, including with myself. I was the only Black person
Mm.
in that hospital, and that had its own
Yeah.
dynamic.
You know, something that's interesting, we're in California, and right now, um, whether it's, hair court or, the expansion of the expansion of the definition of gravely disabled,
Hmm.
conservatorships, all of those things
Yep.
are still happening. And they're happening at even more, at rates that are even higher than they've been. And the state is even expanding this. They want this to be easier. They want it to be easier to put people away and lock
Hmm.
them up. And as you can imagine, Black people with disabilities are more likely to be
Oh yeah.
disproportionately impacted by this. So
Oh
if you
yeah.
could just kind of tie a knot on that, that'd be great.
Well, I mean, but we are right. I mean,
Yeah.
and sadly, I mean, if you're looking at like homeless people,
Mm.
you know, who are the ones that they're, and I think the thing about, being Black and disabled, um, is that oftentimes for a lot of us Black folks, our disabilities are the result of either racism or racist practices. Moms not having, enough access, prenatal medicine, and whatnot, Black moms, um, things of that nature. I mean, even if you look at school, that prison, that school to prison pipeline, they're talking about
Mm.
Black kids
Yes.
because it's Black kids, that are the ones that Black kids who are, when I was in Washington, D.C., I found out when I was living in Washington, D.C., I found out that little Black boys were disproportionately yanked out of regular schools and placed in segregated school settings in Virginia and Maryland
Hmm.
because they were disabled. and you know, either that or Black children's behavior gets pathologized,
Absolutely.
criminalized. Stuff that little white kids get away with, no way a Black
Right.
child is going to get away with that. And let me tell you something. When I was coming up in school, we had corporal punishment.
Mm.
We had teachers whooping our butts.
Mm.
Okay. And guess who got it? And then
Mm.
in the Black classes, really, guess who got it? The darker skinned kids,
Mm.
you
Yeah.
know, or you had, as in my case, when I was in kindergarten, white teachers
Mm.
abusing Black students. I can't
Yeah.
tell you how many times that teacher waterboarded me, just for like stick my face in water, just for like, I mean, at 5 years old. So we Black kids, you know, we grow, we go through it, and it's a direct result of racism. And when you have racism compounded by disability, and that's why I get upset with a lot in our Black community, because a lot of folks in the Black community treat Black disabled people like we're white Karens demanding stuff,
Mm.
And I don't I don't understand where this comes from. Maybe it's the last hallmarks of enslavement, where people had to have value and whatnot. And if you didn't have that, I don't know. But
Right.
even now, um, you know, there's some Black disabled who find a home in the Black community, but it's very, very rare. And what ends up happening is we Black disabled wind up finding a home within ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
within our own, community.
Well, it's been wonderful to get to know you better. Thank you once again for coming out to California for the DRC Gala this year. Thank you
Oh,
for
that was
all the
so much
advocacy.
fun. That was.
Good, good.
And I will be
Um,
back in California in the Oakland area in August.
Fantastic. Well, we can't wait. We hope to be able to see you and connect. But thank
Great.
you again so much for joining the game plan. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. It was my pleasure and an honor to be here.